The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast on achieving the potential of variable rate irrigation. I'm Ben Gist with Excess Inc. and Ag Veritas, and I'll be serving as your host this morning. So, as we get started, first I'd like to thank all you for joining us today. We're really excited about this latest topic for the Precision Ag Insight webinar series, and also to hear Chad's thoughts and experience on variable rate irrigation, which is the topic this morning. So I want to quickly share with you the format of our webcast, which we're planning to keep to about 45 minutes to be respectful of your time this morning. And so first thing, we've muted all the phones and computer microphones for all you listening in to reduce the excess noise. But we do want you to actively participate with us throughout the webcast by using the questions area of those webcast controls that you'll see on the right side of your screen. And so if you have any comments or questions you'd like us to address, just use that questions box and we'll get to those questions throughout the webcast or have a Q&A session at the end as time allows. And one last note, we are recording today's session. So next week we'll be sending an email out to all the folks who registered and attended with the links to this presentation and the recorded webcast, so you can review them at your convenience or share them with your colleagues. And so, like I said, I'm the host this morning, but Chad is our speaker. And Chad is the owner of Godsey Precision Ag, and he's going to share some of his thoughts and experience on variable rate irrigation this morning. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Chad, and he's going to kind of give us a high-level overview of what he wants to cover today in the webcast.
All right, thanks, Ben. Good morning, everybody, and echo Ben's sentiments of thanking you for attending this morning. We're going to basically cover two things this morning. First thing we'll go into is just a basic overview of some of the VRI systems. I know most everybody is probably familiar with those, but when we get into analysis and actually experimental, setup or an ideal setup, it does kind of depend on what kind of variable rate irrigation system we're using. So we'll get into some of those basics and some of the difficulties or challenges that you may face that I've encountered over the last couple of years. Then the second thing that we'll focus on is an actual example, case study, if you will, that we did last year, and we did the analysis at the end of 2015 growing season. So we'll actually look at a field and go through what we could have done better, some of the things that we found, and kind of what we're going to do moving forward. So maybe it'll provide some insight if you're getting ready to do something similar in 2016. So that's kind of what we have planned for this morning, Ben.
Okay, great. So, Chad, before you jump in and start with the first topic, which is the sort of overview of variable rate irrigation, I wanted to start with the first registration question that you all were asked when you signed up for this webcast. And the question that we asked you all was, have you or your growers used variable rate irrigation or performed irrigation trials? And so these are the results of your responses to that question. And so it looks like almost half of you use variable rate irrigation or have in some way. And Chad, I'm just curious, how do you think that this compares with the percentage of growers in your region, given it's a heavily irrigated one?
Yeah, I think those results are fairly close. I think in my area, at least, a lot of people have kind of, I guess, you dabbled, if you will, in it, but really kind of unsure if they're doing a good job or if they're seeing any benefit from it. So yeah, so it is kind of surprising to see, though, over the attendees or the registration questions from across the U.S. that nearly half of them. So that is surprising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's surprisingly high to me too. So Chad, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you then to kind of start with your introduction to VRI.
Okay, thanks. Really, just a quick statement here. Effectively evaluating VRI, it's a lot more difficult when we compare it to, say, trying to make comparisons with variable rate seeding or fertilizer applications. And really the complexity or the difficulty comes in with trying to have an adequate check or reference strip. And a lot of this goes back to the control. We're not controlling, in most instances, we're not controlling every 5 foot or 6 rows of a planter or something like that, or 2 rows of a planter. We're controlling larger spans, and we just don't have the resolution, I guess you would say, that we do with a lot of things as far as seeding and fertilizer applications go. So that's really the difficulty, and that's the biggest difficulty that we've had, is getting or pinpointing those ideal check strips, the size of them, the locations, and things like that. And that's what you'll see kind of throughout the, especially the case study, when we get to it, the problems that we've faced and things that we can do better. So just a quick background on, the common VR systems. And like I said earlier, most everybody is familiar with this, with these systems. The first one, the most basic, I guess you would say, is what I call sector-based VRI, and most people refer to it as sector-based. So basically, you're dividing your pivot or field up into pie-like slices. And each unique irrigation amount is usually accomplished by just altering the pivot speed at each pie slice, if you will. This is no doubt probably the most common. It's really the one that was brought to market first in most areas of the country. And it's definitely the most affordable too. So that's the most common that we see currently out in the field is a sector-based VRI. And then if we think about the other two systems, VRI systems, the next one, it kind of takes you up a step as far as the resolution, increasing that resolution, or management of scale of management, would be zone VRI. So basically, we're taking those pie slices and dividing them up into rings, if that makes sense. So this does give you a little higher level of precision, like I said. Depending on the number of zones or banks of nozzles along that sprinkler span, we potentially could have several thousand individually managed zones. Typically you could have 2 to, I think the highest that I've heard of is 82 zones along a sprinkler span. So really, it does increase the resolution and the scale at which you can manage. So that's the second type. Third type is nozzle by nozzle control, and this is definitely the newest system or VRI system that's out there. And obviously, like it indicates, you're controlling each nozzle individually. And there's a few of these systems around. Obviously, cost is an issue with these type of systems, but I have seen several, and they do work effectively. So those are just a little bit of background. Most everybody's familiar with those, but those are the 3 types that we commonly see out in the field. And Ben, if you go ahead and go to the next slide. When we're setting up zones for those fields to VRI, there's several different factors that people typically look at, and everybody has tried to come up with a unique method. Everybody has a preferred method, but typically these 6 factors are usually what is included, or a combination of these. Similar approaches to seeding or fertility zones. Oftentimes you'll see that EC, EM sleds are often pulled over these to get the EC data. Slope, soil texture, elevation is one that I don't have listed, and then multi-year yield history. So, everybody has their preferred method that they use when delineating these zones, and I think this is one of the areas that we kind of need to still improve on, as far as scheduling or managing irrigation or VRI is delineating those zones. And I guess that's when we get into the case study, that's really what we're after, or in the beginning stages of trying to find a right answer on how to best delineate these zones. So we'll quick go through some just basics on what I would consider ideal setups, and this is kind of what I have discovered after the last 2 or 3 years of trying to come up with systems or trials to evaluate sector, zone, or nozzle by nozzle control. When looking at sector-based VRI, in a perfect world, if the producer will allow to basically alternate every 30 degrees, so the blue indicates a flat uniform rate, so that 30 degrees would be historic management or whatever the producer has historically done or applied. That's what that would get, a flat rate. And then the next 30 degrees would be where you could vary the rate. In theory, this is an ideal setup, and you can pick where those 30 degrees are. They don't have to be exactly on 0 and 180 degrees like this setup is. But this is an ideal setup, and gives you the most information at the end of the year to start making some sound decisions on as far as management zones and things like that. So that's an ideal setup for sector base. If we go into zone and VR or nozzle by nozzle, these two are relatively the same, so I've kind of lumped them in the same category. The first thing with this, and one thing that I struggled with on a few years ago when we were first getting started in this, was understanding the file format. Some systems, and more systems, are becoming, I guess, what I'll call shapefile friendly, in that they'll accept a shapefile. So it does give you the capability to make some more complicated check strips or place those at specific areas in the field. Most systems still require the XML file types, so a little less flexibility as far as placing those. But yeah, just I wanted to put a comment in there to understand what file type or format is required. Second point I want to make is for zone or nozzle, is that we really need to maintain at least at a minimum of 20 to 30% of the area in the field as a check, or that uniform, or what the producer has historically done. A lot of times with seeding and fertilizer, we maybe can get by with less than 20%. But I have found with irrigation, you need at a minimum of 20, if not 30%. And also, it's very important not to have that 20 to 30% be contiguous. Spread it out throughout the field. Don't have it all in one area of the field. And that becomes even more important as the more a field varies in soil type or elevation or whatever it may be. And then the last point I want to make on this slide is just that VRI, the application's typically not as precise as with fertilizer or seeding equipment. The edges of the zones may receive, or they will receive, overthrow from neighboring nozzles or runoff in some cases. So check zones, if you're using a shapefile, check zones need to be relatively large. And I have greater than 2 acres. I think ideally you probably would want it in the 5 to 10 acre range, as long as it fits in that field or in that zone. So that's kind of some of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years, where we've kind of made mistakes early on, and things that we've tried to get better on. So with so this is just an example of the nozzle by nozzle where we were able to load a shape file onto the control panel. And basically you can see here, just for instance, that the red down towards the bottom of that field, we have a purple, a zone that's half purple and half blue. So that was one of our relatively large zones where we split that nearly in half, and we included the right side as our medium check. So that actually was receiving a higher rate of water than the blue side. So you do have a little bit more flexibility, like I indicated, with when you're using shape files to make those check areas or check strips. But you still do have to be really careful, especially with overthrow and things like that. So you need pretty good size zones to be able to split them to include a check strip. Just one quick comment on other data to collect. Soil moisture data, most of the time when we are using VRI, we are coupling these with soil moisture probes. And really the more soil moisture data you can collect in as many zones as possible, the better the end of the year analysis is going to be. And obviously the better able you're going to be to schedule irrigation. So, collect as much soil moisture data as you can throughout the growing season. Collect irrigation amounts and rainfall. Obviously, it helps you quantify, how much water, quantify the savings of water, if that's what you're going for. It makes that a lot easier, and it's a lot more accurate as well. And then obviously any other observations that may have impacted yield, whether it would be insect damage, hail, weed, or whatever. So that's an obvious thing, but really the soil moisture data is really a key cog in that wheel of trying to explain differences at the end of the season.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. And that actually segues nicely into the second question that we asked all of you listening in when you signed up for the webinar, which was, what percentage of your growers are using these soil moisture sensors actively? And these are the results to your responses to that question. And so it looks like for about 75% of you either don't use, or less than 15% of your growers are actively using these soil moisture sensors. And Chad, we actually had a question come in from someone for you, which was asking, what do you think is leading to the low adoption of soil moisture sensors? Is it the value or perceived value from the data, or the cost of the sensors?
Yeah, Ben, that's a really good question. I think it's definitely a combination, or at least in my opinion, a combination of both. I mean, most of these sensors are fairly costly. And really, I think a lot of producers struggle with seeing the value of that data, where it's, if you only have one probe in a 120 or 130 acre field, that's a snapshot of that entire 120 acres in that one spot. So even if you have it in, let's say the sandiest part of the field, it's representing that soil type, and that's about it. So I think we have a long ways to go in, the soil moisture measurement in general, to get it where producers, will widely accept it and use it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and so that sort of leads into the third and final question that you all were asked and responded to when registering for the webcast, and that was, how do your growers who are using these soil moisture sensors use that data to make a management decision? And these are the responses to that question that you all responded to. And so looking at this, it looks like of the folks who are using those soil moisture sensors, almost half are using that data for their weekly irrigation strategy. And Chad, you sort of touched on this a few different times throughout what you've discussed so far, but if you had to kind of summarize how you use this data to lead to an actual management decision, or create value from it, You know, what's the main value from these sensors and their data?
That's a good question as well. I think everybody that I know, consultant or farmer, uses them in a little different method. Where we see the biggest benefit is kind of a double check for our week-to-week scouting. But early in the season and late in the season, it no doubt helps with scheduling irrigation. As well as after relatively heavy rainfall events, you have a better idea of when to initiate irrigation again. So those are the areas where we use them the most, is early season, late season, then after rainfall events. And we always look at them every week. And most of the time, there's nothing like ground truthing. So that's where it's nice to be able to get out there and get your hands on the soil and through 4 or 5 different areas of that field to see what that soil moisture is. So you definitely use them, but yeah, there's definite times when you need that ground truthing to go with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of I'm understanding what you just said, right? It's more for use throughout the season for making early, mid, late season changes and management decisions, and less kind of about the end of year analysis piece of it. Is that fair to say?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. It does. The one benefit you have at the end of the year is, if you don't use them throughout the season, you do have that data at the end of the year to look back and say, oh man, I did a pretty good job, or yeah, I could have done a little better here or that, or applied a little more or a little less. So definitely value in both.
Well, great. Well, so I know that the second piece that we wanted to look at today was a real example of a VRI trial that you did with one of your growers, Chad. And so we got a couple of slides here that introduce some of the characteristics on that field and the setup of that trial. And so do you want to kind of walk us through a little bit of background on what we'll be looking at here?
Yeah, definitely. So this field is approximately 120 acres in size, relatively sandy soil throughout the field. We just basically, you could say, we have different levels of quality of sand. At the left there is the soils map, which follows the yield history quite closely. So it actually is an example of where the soils map it does a pretty good job of explaining quite a bit of the variability. The Haxton loamy sand, I'll just mention that in reference to some later slides. That is the highest, the productivity of that soil type is quite a bit higher than any of the valent sands that you'll see at the bottom of that legend. So we have that's soil type on the right-hand side is multi-year yield, and this is what we base our seeding and infertility zones on. So just to give you an idea, you can see it matches the soils map relatively close. So just wanted to provide that as a background. It'll help potentially help explain some of the results that we did see. So that's kind of the background there, Ben. Okay, this slide has the irrigation zones that we kind of developed in the check plots, and the soils is on the left still, and then our irrigation zones is on the right. And so basically, we just had two zones. So our hypothesis was that we needed to put late in the season, we needed to put a little bit more water on the sandier areas of the field, just because we had less water holding capacity. Our soil profile was almost depleted by the time the sprinkler got back around to that area. So that was our initial hypothesis, I guess you could say, and so that's why we kind of put our check plots or our slow zones in the areas that we did. Now, like I said, I've learned a lot since we put this out in 2014 and 15. We need to make our check plots bigger. So like that's the 5-degree slice that's going to the south of the pivot there. will be a lot bigger in 2016. You know, on paper, 5 degree, or at least in my mind, 5 degrees seemed like quite a wide area. In reality, it's not. And so we really missed out on a lot in that area of the field. So that was our zones, and like I said, they'll be different moving forward, and you'll see why here in the next few slides.
Great.
So this is we ran all this or the yield through Ag Veritas to get a more depth analysis instead of just comparing average yields, you know, side by side in those pie slices. So I'm actually going to take a step back and let Ben explain some of the background on this slide before we go any further.
Yeah, absolutely, Chad. So some of you all listening in may already be familiar with Ag Veritas, but for those who aren't, the screen that you're looking at right now is a screenshot of the summary results, or the summary table from Chad's variable irrigation trial. And so the first thing that you probably are noticing is that 75%, the explanatory power. And so what that number means is that with the stack of variables or data layers that you see in that chart, so Chad's management zones, the soil types, elevation, irrigation trial, and also the spatial effects areas, which I'll touch on in a moment. With those factors, we are explaining about 75% of the variability and yield on the field. And that's a pretty significantly high number on the end of what we typically see in these analyses. And really what probably lends to that is that you'll also see that these different factors are ranked with a bar to the right of them that shows the length of that bar is the relative impact that a factor is having and how it explains variability and yield. And so with these management zones, which are explaining a lot of that variability, um, those are really by design, by Chad's approach to establish those, meant to capture the variability on the field. And so you'd hope, I think, Chad, to see that high on the chart, because it means that you're delineating zones that are effectively addressing that variability. So that's one. Or go ahead, Chad.
Oh no, yeah, I was gonna say you're right on. We like to see management zones high at the list because that means we're doing a good job of capturing the differences in yield, variability in yield with those zones.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of those pat yourself on the back findings if you're in Chad's shoes. And then I guess one other thing I wanted to point out here is you'll notice that there are two factors, planting and fertilizer, that are shown under the chart as very little or no explanatory power. And what that means is the fertilizer recommendation, so the nitrogen program, and also the variable seeding, Chad said were those applications followed those management zones. And so a factor can be kicked out the way planting or fertilizer are here if they don't add any additional explanatory power or explain any additional variability than one of the other factors on this chart. And so in this case, this is what you would expect, since those applications were almost identical to those management zones themselves. The management zones are what's really explaining that variability. And so it's just one thing to keep in mind, because we know that seeding rate and nitrogen have an impact on yield. It's just that those applications aren't adding any additional explanatory power to this. And so, Chad, before I jump over to the next slide, was there anything on this chart that surprised you, or is this sort of a positive finding, what you would expect? Just kind of curious, are there any takeaways that you found from it?
No, I don't think so. I guess it's nice to see, like I said, the management zones, soil types, we knew that played a role, elevation as well. There's a relatively big hill in one area of the field, so, and then our irrigation zones were significant. Yeah, nothing surprising, and it was good to see irrigation zones in there. So yep, that pretty much summarizes it.
Yeah, and those zones being there on the chart and where they are sort of indicates that there was a yield response, positive or negative. We'll see later on, but there was a response to the different rates, and so at least we know there's the variable irrigation is having some impact on yield, and so that's kind of, I think, the first takeaway here.
Yep.
And so I mentioned in the last slide that there are also these spatial effect areas that were explaining some of the yield variability. And so I want to take just a second to uh, describe what these spatial effects are. And so the way that Ag Veritas works, and it's really one of the strengths of the analysis, is once we've accounted for the impact that that stack of data that you included is having on yield, we then look for areas in the field where the yield is unexpectedly or unexplainably high or low based on everything we know about what's going on in that area. And so these are areas where that yield is unexplainably high, and it's due to some factor that isn't one of the factors you included in the analysis. And so, Chad, when we were looking at this example together the other day, I think we pointed at one of these areas you identified, and it's that negative spatial effect, that orange area in the far east of this field. And that looked like one of the more common examples of a spatial effect that we'll see, which is kind of turn rows or abnormally low yield to compaction. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Oftentimes, like along the east side there, those turn rows will see negative spatial effects. So yep, you're right on.
Yeah, and I think the real power here, one is identifying where these areas are, and maybe it's an opportunity to scout what's going on there if you don't know what's causing it. But the real power here is these spatial effect areas like the compaction area we're seeing on the east there. They become another variable in the analysis, and so when you want to at the end isolate one factor like the irrigation rate, and you want an accurate assessment on how much is that differing rates contributing to yield, you want to be able to factor in the impact that these spatial effects are having, so you can so they don't skew your results and you get a more accurate assessment of that trial. And so I think as we'll see later on, through the results, it just adds an extra confidence level and accuracy when you are getting a sort of final answer to, hey, how did this trial work, or how did this rate perform? And before I move on, Chad, do any of these other areas jump out at you? Do you recognize what's going on in any of these?
No, the only potential ones would be some of those other negative spatial effects. I think probably are associated with some really sandy knobs and stuff that perhaps the soils map just wasn't high enough resolution to pick up and help explain some of that. So that would be my guess on some of those other ones, but that's about it. So like you said, one of those things that probably need to investigate early this spring.
Great. So Chad, do you want to kind of walk us through, I know you had a few slides here that are looking at the different yield trends from that trial across different soils and other characteristics. So just take a moment here and kind of walk us through what we're seeing on this chart.
Okay, yep, sure thing, Ben. Yeah, so if you guys recall, our hypothesis was that the irrigation or the additional irrigation or that slow zone would provide a benefit in the lower yielding areas of the field or the worst sand. So you can see it was kind of opposite of what we thought. The Phalant sand, where we had 3 to 9% slope, we actually saw a decrease in yield of 9 bushel by slowing that sprinkler down. And we just slowed it down late in the season, and we weren't putting a tremendous amount more of water on. Basically, it was about 0.2 per irrigation pass. So season long, we put on roughly no more than two more inches, during the entire season. So it's not like we were putting a tremendous amount more on, but you can see the negative yield impact that we had on that worse sand. which kind of contradicts what we maybe hypothesized at the first. The red box indicates the positive yield response that we did see on that Haxton loamy sand, which was some of our more productive soil. You can see that we, around a 4 bushel increase when we slowed that sprinkler down. So that is kind of in a nutshell as far as averaging by soil type. And that's one of the nice things about Ag Veritas, is being able to view things in different variables. So we knew soil type had a big impact, and this is the average yields. When we break it down into management zone on the next slide, if we kind of generically break them into 4 different zones, our really low areas, our worst sand, low, average yielding zones, and then our high yielding zones. You can see that in our low yielding zones, that worst sand in the field, we actually saw yield decrease. In the average to high, we saw relatively fairly similar yield in the average zones, and then an increase in the high zones by around 5 bushels, or that 4 to 5 bushels. So kind of opposite of what we thought, and this kind of steering our direction is what's. And I guess you go ahead and flip to the next slide, Ben. And like I was getting ready to say, that this kind of guiding us moving forward. So one of the things that we did, we took the analysis a step further in Ag Veritas and look at the profit analysis, because obviously the producer is most interested in his return on investment on variable rate irrigation, and also just his profit bottom line. So some of the assumptions that we made: crop price of $3.75, required return of 10%, irrigation input, the normal zone, just to make it more simple. We figured the slow rate cost about $9 an acre more, which is probably fairly conservative. But that was our slow rate, was $9 more, so we just set the normal rate at $1 and the slow rate at $10 an acre, and then we assumed everything else was the same. So we plan on having the same management zones, same seeding zones, end zones, and soils and elevation, of course, will not change. So we left everything else. We assumed everything else would be the same as last year, and I'll let Ben go to the next slide and explain this map a little bit before we discuss some of the details in it.
Yeah, sure. So when I switch slides here, there's going to be our variable rate profit map. And so what we do is, to generate that map that you'll see, is we take these inputs and costs that Chad has on this screen. So the difference in cost between that extra water and the return on investment you want from putting down that extra water, and then factoring in the impact that all those factors included in the analysis are having on yield. We take the one trial factor, so irrigation in this case, and we want to evaluate, okay, what's the best rate or approach and where on the field. And when I say best, it's really the most profitable rate. And so that's where you're seeing on the map here, where those blue areas are the areas where that normal irrigation approach, or that standard rate, was the more profitable, or would be next year under similar conditions. But then we see these other areas that are in green on the map, and that's where the slower approach, or the higher irrigation rates, actually were a profitable investment for that producer, and under similar conditions would be next year. And so, Chad, I kind of turn it back to you, because this is what we think about when you see a map like this, which is, okay, how do you turn this into a management decision, or influence your plan for next year?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ben. And obviously, this map is illustrating profit, so this is what we're after, and this is what the farmer's after. And so, as you can see, some of our thinking was in 2015 was kind of backwards, and it may have been an indication, or it may be a result of the year that we had. We had a relatively cool and wet year in this area. So some of the results may have been influenced by that. So we definitely, moving forward, we're going to continue this trial, but we're going to make our check plots bigger, our sectors bigger. And definitely include, a check plot, a 30-degree sector in that contains a lot of that green area. So we're going to start managing that zone a little differently, or see if we can and maintain that profitability, like this profit map indicates. So it does definitely, Ben, give us some insight on areas that of the field that may be responsive, where we really had no idea, until we did the profit map, where those areas were. We were basically guessing where we thought it was being responsive, and it turned out in 2015 we were totally wrong. So we'll see in 2016 what it looks like.
Yeah, another good learning opportunity for next year. Well, it'll be interesting to see how these patterns hold up, and with your kind of tweaks to the trial setup.
Yep, definitely. So to provide a quick summary, understand the limitations of the system, and that goes back to, sector versus zone, or nozzle by nozzle, and some of our findings, in this from this one field. It may be a limitation of the system. He may be better, it may be profitable for him to invest in a zone-based system to get a higher response. So that's something that you need to understand the limitations of the system. And then obviously the establishing check strips take time, and reflect on where you think you will see a response, or likely to see a response, but make sure you have those alternating check strips, especially with the sector-based, throughout the field, especially in year one. Year two, maybe you can start going backwards and having a few less, if you feel comfortable with with your VRI approach. And then obviously it's important, that the initial interpretation of the yield data, I just put that in there to, make sure that you've got some good baseline yield data, and then make sure you take time, obviously, to calibrate combines and things like that. I always like to mention that. So oftentimes it doesn't get done, or it's after the fact, which you can do, but just pay attention to it. And then add check plot. That's my last point. And just add one more, based on my experience. Add one more than you think that you need, is a good general rule of thumb from what I've found, especially with the VRI.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. And I think, yep, that's that's going to wrap up our summer, or our webcast this morning. And so I just want to, before we conclude, thank all you again for listening in this morning. And as always, we hope you found the content valuable and worth your time. And so one thing I want to mention is that you will all get a survey at the conclusion of this webcast. And these are really important to us to get your feedback for future topics and ways to improve. And there's also a place in the survey to ask for more information about Ag Veritas, to learn more about our yield analysis software, or about what Chad's doing with Godsey Precision Ag. And finally, if we didn't get to one of your questions this morning, we'll follow up with you individually with a response. So we will get back to you with any questions that were asked during the webcast. And so with that, thanks again to all of you, and Chad also for sharing your thoughts this morning, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Ben.
Bye, Chad.